Over the past 3 decades, China has been the site of one of the most dramatic economic expansion stories in human history. Some would call it the most successful capitalist experience in human history. With China's growing prosperity, making the country now the second biggest economy on earth, has come also geopolitical assertiveness. We can clearly see that in our part of the world, where China is flexing its muscles in adjacent waters from the East China Sea to the Taiwan Straits and the South China Sea. In fact, we're seeing China also extending its influence across the Pacific and across the world as it becomes the most dominant superpower in the post-colonial world. But the rise of China as a global superpower has presented a dilemma to the rest of the world. In ASEAN, we look at China as both opportunity and also as a challenge. The same is true across much of the world. But in the United States, China is increasingly seen as a peer competitor. And especially in the past few years, we see the discussion over China becoming central to America's conception of itself and its place in the world. The result is a unique bipartisan consensus on the need to face the so-called China challenge. And over the past 5-6 years or so, we see that from the Trump to the Biden administration, there seems to be a continuity in America's approach to China. The upshot is what many experts call the new Cold War. A new Cold War because it very much looks like the bipolar global order we saw back in the 20th century when the Soviet Union was competing with the American-led West. Some would even argue that this is the real Cold War because the Soviet Union never had the economic and the industrial heft to really match the West or even America alone. But China doesn't only boast one of the biggest armed forces in the world. Its economy is already the second biggest in the world, and some expect it to be the biggest in the foreseeable future. More than that, China is beginning to dominate cutting-edge technologies, from artificial intelligence to 5G telecommunication network and EV cars. China is now a global force to reckon with. And that's why many fear that if there's one power that's going to displace America as a global hegemon or end Western dominance over the past half a millennia, that's going to be China. And today we have a very special guest. This is someone who has been at the center of America's China strategy over the past few years. He played an instrumental role in Trump administration's national defense strategy, which very much focused on China, and is calling on the American presidents for the foreseeable future to really focus on China rather than Russia or other supposed rogue states. Thank you for joining us, Elbridge Colby. There's lots of titles, lots of background. You have one of those special CVs. First of all, tell us a little bit about yourself, because you have gained a lot of attention in the past few months, especially for those who are China watchers, American foreign policy watchers, and shortly we'll also talk about that US elections. Where's this coming from? Why are you so important nowadays?
Well, I don't know. That's for others to judge. Well, thank you. First of all, thank you for having me on your show, Richard, and the opportunity to speak here in Manila, where I'm visiting after I was at the Shangri-La Dialogue last weekend. So really wanted to come and spend some time in Manila in the Philippines, which is, I think, really, truly one of the most important countries for the United States in the world, especially all that's going on over the last few months. So wanted to get a ground view of what's going on. So it's really wonderful to be able to talk to you. A bit about me. I guess I'm one of those kind of creatures of the American system, which you're kind of. I've served in the government off and on. I've basically been in the national security kind of foreign policy world in the United States since I left college quite a little bit longer ago than I would hope. But I spent some time in the government working in various capacities in the Bush administration at a very junior level.
Right.
I then went to law school, and I got more and more interested in the strategy issues. And so I've done a couple more stints in government, but I've mostly been outside. I'm a Republican, so it's mostly been Democratic government. So I've been working in think tanks, obviously traveling a lot. And my probably most noteworthy government service was under the beginning of the Trump administration, when I served as sort of the guy who led the strategy development in the 2018
Right, so the national defense strategy of the Trump administration, we're really talking about 2018 here, more or less, right? You are credited as one of the chief architects of that. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Why was there a need for a new Is it because Trump just wanted something new? What was going on there? Yeah.
Well, I think I think here in the Philippines, you understand very well why it was needed. And I think the experience with the Chinese, what was the 2018 National Defense Strategy? What it was basically, in my view, a pretty simple message to the American defense establishment, to our allies and our government, saying, look, great power competition is back, especially China, and we need to prepare for it. And we need to get back to the basics of what our military is for, which is to deter a war by being prepared for it, and we need to focus on the primary actor. Whether we've done such a good job is another issue in implementing it, but that was the message. Right. And I think you can see here, in the preceding years in the South China Sea, is an excellent and unfortunate petri dish example of why that was needed, because the Chinese had become more and more brazen and aggressive. Of course, the 9-Dash Line, Scarborough Shoal, Xi Jinping lying to President Obama in the Rose Garden, all of these things. There had been a pivot to Asia before, an attempt, and I don't want to cast too much negativity on it. I thought it was a worthwhile effort. But I think what was lacking, and what President Trump and the administration brought to it, was a willingness to say China is the problem here. We need to focus on China. We need to call a spade a spade.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And basically adapt our policy accordingly. Not to make China into an adversary unnecessarily, but of course they had already been going on militarizing the features in the South China Sea and expanding them, and already had initiated an unprecedented military buildup that's only continued.
And your sense is there was not sufficient recognition under the previous administration? Because to put it in perspective, some would say, you serve in the Bush administration, they would say there was too much obsession with the global war on terror, too much obsession with fighting, extremism. It was a concern, and that was precisely when China made a huge stride. That's a center of the arguments of people like Farid Zakari arguing this is a post-American era, right? But some would say, wasn't the pivot to Asia of the Obama administration, in particular how Hillary Clinton approached that issue, wasn't that a recognition that China was now a problem, and this is the region we have to focus on?
Well, there's a lot going on. I think the Bush administration's policy, and I was a very junior official, I think it was not successful with the United States, to put it mildly. And even at the time, I was a very junior kind of person, but I was very much out of sorts with the attitude of the Bush administration, which you could characterize as an almost millenarian kind of a progressive sort of messianic view, where you look at President Bush's second inaugural, the attempt to end tyranny in the world. This is the global war on terrorism. It's like the global war on crime, and I think the best evidence is that the Chinese referred to that period as the period of strategic opportunity. It was the best thing that ever happened to China because it distracted us. In fact, at the beginning of the Bush administration, there were important people who were saying, look, China's rising, their military is developing, we should focus on them. And then our whole system got it was a tragedy. I had friends who were affected by it and so forth. But at the end of the day, terrorism is a relatively manageable problem compared to a great power competition. I think the Obama administration, to its credit, was actually trying to shift gears on that. And I think the pivot within the confines of the political situation at the time was, and at the time I supported it, but I think what it lacked was a kind of clear-eyed and clear-headed approach. And so, no strategy can take place in a vacuum. So don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to bash on the pivot. But by the time we reached early 2017, there were elements in the Obama administration, at the end of the Obama administration, for instance, in the Pentagon, Robert Work, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, who were talking about the problem posed by China and the need to focus on it. But they were being kind of shunted aside or marginalized. It's maybe a little strong, but kind of put in their place. And what we in the Trump administration, certainly in the Pentagon, we said is, no, this is the problem to focus on. And the point here was not to precipitate a conflict. The conflict was already there. In a sense, the rivalry was already there. We just hadn't been recognizing it.
Right. Let me just bring in the Philippines a little bit, because our sense with the pivot to Asia was that it was high on rhetoric, but when it comes to delivery, it came up short, especially in 2012. We're talking about barely half a year after the Obama speech in the Australian Parliament about pivot to Asia. There comes the biggest test, which is Scarborough Shoal, several months of naval standoff between Philippines and China, and the Philippines was essentially begging for American assistance in whatever way, and for some reason it was not there. And to make things more complicated, 2 years later, after we even negotiated the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, which we can discuss more later on, President Obama was really wishy-washy. I know you're a lawyer yourself, but Yale Law School, but maybe it's a Harvard law school. But you get what I'm saying? Like the idea of he tried to compare the situation in South China Sea to Canada, America, and he said bunch of rocks, which we found very offensive. So we had a sense that we were not being taken seriously enough, if not completely taken for granted by the Obama administration. That's why, interestingly, a lot of Filipinos were very supportive of the Trump administration, and they felt he's the tough guy. And I remember very well, we'll discuss it later on. I mean, when the Democrats were coming back under Biden, there was a panic. And I said, no. I think by now there's a bipartisan consensus, which we're going to discuss now. But what is your read of that? Do you think that the pivot to Asia was kind of like overlooking countries like the Philippines, which are already at the front line of China's assertiveness?
Well, I think your analysis, I mean, I agree with the Philippine assessment of the situation. It was a historic mistake to handle the Scarborough Shoal situation in that way. And I think, the pivot to Asia probably reflected certain elements within the administration that were willing to push it, but when push came to shove, the president and his key advisors were not, and people like Susan Rice, and you saw that in behavior over the ensuing 5 years. And I think those of us in the Trump administration who were working on this essentially agreed with the Philippine situation. Why were we allowing ourselves to be intimidated from helping the Philippines on a claim that we already supported? So this is the kind of ambiguity that, of course, by now I think has been largely, hopefully, I mean, not entirely, but, the announcement by Secretary Pompeo that we were going to recognize that attacks on Philippine armed forces.
The March 2019.
And then has been extended under this administration, to your point. Now, what I would say is that, I mean, there's a lot of water under the bridge.
Sure.
Where we are now is there is a fair amount of consensus, but I still think we face the problem between rhetoric and reality, especially in Asia. This has been the problem for our country. And so I think there has been a degree of taking the Philippines for granted, but in a sense, there's probably been an element of taking the whole region
for granted
or underestimating it. I mean, I think if we look right now at the Ukraine situation, our government says that China's the priority. It says that Asia's the center. That's what the President Obama said 12 years ago in the pivot speech. And yet, or 11 years, it's still, Europe has this captivating hold, and of course the Middle East is still there. And this is the fundamental thing that I'm trying to break off, that I'm trying to say, look, Asia's 50% or more of global GDP. You come to a country like the Philippines, and you cannot be but impressed by the scale and rapidity of development and energy that you see throughout ASEAN. And yet, we're spending all this attention on Europe and the Middle East, and that's the problem.
I mean, this is what's fascinating for a lot of us outsiders when we're in America. I mean, of course, as Filipinos, America feels eerily familiar, but generally we see this
hopefully not eerie,
big gap, or
right now,
some would say pleasantly familiar. I don't want to get in trouble. Like you go to California, you go to the West Coast. Views on China tend to be, let's say, quote unquote, nuanced because of course the economic interest and proximity. And then you go to the East Coast. It's much more hawkish, if I can put it that way. I mean, I know many people will call you hawk, will call me hawk, and it's but at the same time, if you look at the culture in DC, our sense is it's very transatlantic. We even call DC a kind of a European city, right? It's so easy to get attention of people in DC when you have a talk on Middle East even, than ASEAN. I mean, which is what, I mean, in Stanford, you wouldn't have much problem getting a lot of interest in ASEAN, but it's very hard to get that in DC. I mean, I've given a lot of talks there throughout the years. And so we see this weird disconnect or kind of a split screen situation. Like, and now with the conflict in Ukraine, it looks like, again, the rhetoric versus reality kind of divide is brought into fore because Ukraine is really I mean, Ukraine got like $42 billion of assistance. Philippines got like $100 million of foreign.
I mean, that's crazy.
I mean, of course, we're not being invaded yet.
But it could happen.
Right. I mean, and my point is like, this is where people like Duterte were coming from. And sometimes it was weird because it's like you feel like the Dutertes of this world are quoting people like me who are like saying the alliance can do much better. And because like Pakistan gets a few $1 billion, Egypt gets $1 billion, of course, Israel is a special case for the US. And then Philippines gets $100 million foreign military financing. It just doesn't match the gravity of the challenge we're facing.
Match. And the problem is, so you're exactly right. That is an accurate assessment. And Washington is where American policy is ultimately made. And it does have a very transatlantic orientation, particularly the older generation, which, I mean, I think commercial people in the United States understand that Asia is the center of the world. But foreign policy and political people in the United States are still more, especially the more senior ones, the older ones, are still, and you see this with President Biden, but you also see it with a number of senior Republicans, they basically think of Europe as the center of the world, and that's a mistake. So I think, this was a tolerable, forgivable mistake 10 years ago. 5 years ago, it was a serious problem. Today, it is unacceptable Because China, look, I was just struck today, and every day you get a new piece. But the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, the well-respected Australian Policy Institute, judged that China is not only ahead of the United States in the majority of the areas that it's tracking, but it says it's so far ahead in some that we may never catch up. And it included, I think, areas of hypersonics and artificial intelligence.
Right.
So what you're talking about is absolutely correct. The question now is what to do with it. And that my difference with a lot of not only foreign policy people in general, but even Asia policy people is how much do we need to shake the system in the United States?
Right.
How sharp do we need to be? And I look at what China's saying, and I was when I was at Shangri-La, I mean, they appear to me to mean serious business, and they are not going to be deflected. Of course, look at their reaction to the arbitral ruling. Look, I mean, not only did they cut off a ship in the Taiwan Strait, they cut off the American ship, not the Canadian ship, which shows they're not intimidated by anybody, because obviously Xi Jinping does not have a lot of respect for Prime Minister
And just
Trudeau.
after the aerial situation.
And just after the RC-135 thing as well. That is showing that they are unafraid. And the body language of Li Shangfu, the defense minister in Beijing, was one of confidence, almost cocky, right? And so my view is we absolutely must shift, and we cannot allow these things, these processes, these attitudes that were understandable 10 years ago to perpetuate, because Lloyd Austin himself, the Secretary of Defense, said at Shangri-La that Xi Jinping has given the PLA the orders to be ready by 2027 to attack Taiwan. Now, if that's, we don't know, that's not a prediction, but in the standards of history, that's actually a pretty strong warning.
Can you enlighten our audience a little bit about the state of affairs in terms of the internal debates in America? Because on one hand, some would say there's already a bipartisan consensus at least on one thing, which is China could be the real peer competition that the Soviet Union never was. And so some would call this the real Cold War, not only the new Cold War, the real one, because Soviet Union never had the kind of manufacturing. I mean, fine, there's the Sputnik moment here and there, but that's it. Essentially giant North Korea probably. That was the situation in there. But that's where you come in, right? Because the impression on a shallow level is like, it's a question of who just wants to be more hawk, out-hawking each other.
Right.
And then the other issue here is, should we be more values-driven or more like just focus on American interests or America first? But you're kind of like something different, right? Like you're coming in because on one hand, there's a Nixonian sense, Kissingerian, in fact, sense to what you're saying, which is, let's accept we cannot control the world. We cannot be millenarian about this. Let's just focus on what we can do. And, I think John Mearsheimer gets a lot of flack for his stance on Ukraine, but I think on China, many people are very appreciative. At the same time, you're also not some would say, for lack of a better term, the Trumpian America first or America alone, some would say, because you're saying we should still work with our allies and the international order works. Can you say, can you tell us where you come in? I mean, what is your difference?
Well, thanks. No, I think that's very astute. I mean, I think too much of the old debate is essentially assumes that the United States is so much more powerful than anybody else that it's a matter of what the tools are that we're going to use to pursue. So the difference 10 years ago, 15 years ago, was between the Hawks and the Doves, which was essentially, the goals were basically the same. And the read of the international situation was the same. It was John Bolton on one side saying we should bash everybody to get what we do, and Tony Blinken or somebody on the other saying, no, we should work through the UN or whatever. But they didn't really disagree about the fundamentals. But the real axis that's orthogonal, that's a new axis, is what's the power situation? That's what we need. And Nixon and Kissinger is exactly Eisenhower, this tradition, Teddy Roosevelt. That's the tradition of saying, look, and the way I look at things is again, it's not that we need to be involved everywhere. It's not that we need to be involved nowhere. It's what's in the best interest of the American people in a world in which we don't control everything. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not somebody who says, wringing their hands, the United States is in decline. We have problems, but who doesn't have problems? China has problems. Europe has problems. Japan has problems. ASEAN has problems. Everybody's got problems. If you're going to bet, the United States is actually a pretty good bet, and that's why a lot of money still goes to the United States and our military, et cetera. But what I'm saying is, for the first time in 150 years, that is a fundamental difference that nobody alive, nobody who probably almost like nobody who knew anybody alive, almost that point was the last time the United States was not the largest economy in the world. That is a dramatic, fundamental shift. Look at World War II. In the Second World War, the United States alone was a larger economy than all three Axis states, and we were allied with the British Empire and the Soviet Union. This is a fundamentally new situation, and my biggest problem with the Washington debate is that everybody's basically acting in the grooves of 20 years ago. So my difference, for instance, on the Republican side, I'm different from a lot of hawks because I'm saying, look, I am in favor of strength vis-a-vis China and standing up to China. But A, we have to recognize how powerful China is. This is not just going to disappear like the Soviet Union did.
You cannot wish it away.
You cannot wish it away. And B, we have to constrain, we have to be more disciplined in our use of power in other theaters. So I get in a lot of trouble, even with Republicans, about the Ukraine situation. And I'm sympathetic to the Ukrainians. I think what the Russians are doing is evil. But, you know, as you said, our foreign policy is not missionary work. It should be to serve the American people's interests. The place where the American people's interests are most impinged upon is here, because Asia is the world's largest economy. And the Chinese are by far, they're 10 times the economic size of Russia. And if China establishes what I believe it's seeking to establish, or at least would like to establish, a sort of a hegemonic control over Asia, where everybody here has to look and say, hey, Beijing, is it okay what we're doing here? That's going to be disastrous for the American people. And that's the basic thing. And so in a way, I think sometimes not to be self-referential, but I sort of scramble the radar of people who are used to the old debates. Oh, is he a hawk or a dove? And I said, well, I mean, I'm going to have a hawk or a dove depending on what the context is. What are you asking? I'm hawkish on China now. I'd like to get to a place of a position of strength where I could pursue détente. And that's my objection to what Kissinger's saying. I actually prefer Nixon to Kissinger. I think many of the best
that's why
ideas.
I kind of wanted to put the distinction there.
Because Kissinger, I think, you know, Kissinger is sort of notionally realist. He's a brilliant writer, etc. I don't think his statecraft advice is very good, because he's basically saying we should go talk to the Chinese in this G2 kind of setting, and the leaders are going to come to some kind of understanding that's going to...
Which is a Brzezinski.
Yeah, but it's kind of romantic. That's not realism. Realism is they recognize strength. And then we go talk to them, but not because we're going to come to some kind of mystical understanding because we talked about the Song Dynasty or whatever. No, they're going to understand that they can't push us around, and by extension can't push our allies around like the Philippines, Japan, Taiwan itself. Then we can come to a modus vivendi. That's the goal. But I think that's different, certainly, than what Kissinger's. In fact,